Hollywood has a graveyard full of movies that never made it to the big screen. Why though? Because apparently we're not allowed to have nice things. Pardon my bleak sense of humor. The truth is, there is never just one reason why a particular film does not work out. Sometimes it is rights drama, sometimes it's money, sometimes it's studio panic. Sometimes the director and the studio are simply trying to make two completely different movies. And that is exactly the case with the 11 Marvel and Marvel-adjacent projects we are about to talk about today. The MCU has been around since 2008, so of course Marvel's big screen history has had its share of dead projects. But even before the MCU, Marvel characters were already trapped in development hell across different studios. Some of those projects were in full swing one day and dead the next. And some of them could have changed superhero movies in a massive way. So without further ado, let's get into it. Ant-Man, directed by Edgar Wright. It goes without saying that Peyton Reed did a fair job with his version of Ant-Man. It was funny, it had all the right jokes, Paul Rudd was Paul Rudd, and that solved half the problems. I mean, the man does not look a day older than his Clueless days. But what if I told you there was another version of Ant-Man that would have been completely different in vibe and feel? Edgar Wright's version. Edgar Wright and Joe Cornish had been linked to Ant-Man since the mid-2000s. This was long before the MCU became the tightly controlled Hollywood machine we know today. When Wright was developing the script, he wanted something closer to a heist-style superhero film built around both Hank Pym and Scott Lang. That alone sounds fascinating because if any director could turn an oddball shrinking superhero into a stylish heist movie, it was Edgar Wright. After all, this is the man behind Shaun of the Dead, Hot Fuzz, Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, and Baby Driver. Fast editing, visual jokes, sharp timing, and chaotic charm are basically his language. But this movie never fully came together under him. Wright had a very specific vision for what Ant-Man should be. The problem was that by the time MCU had grown through Phase 1 and into Phase 2, Marvel's needs had changed. The studio now had a connected universe to maintain, and Wright's more standalone approach no longer fit as easily into the bigger machine. There were rewrites and revisions, but it did not really work out. In 2014, Wright and Marvel parted ways over creative differences. Peyton Reed was then hired to direct, and Adam McKay and Paul Rudd helped rewrite the script. The final film still kept some of Wright and Cornish's DNA, which is why they received story and screenplay credit. But the finished version added more obvious MCU connective tissue, including the Avengers facility sequence, the Quantum Realm setup, and stronger links to the larger franchise. The ripple effect was huge. Because Wright took so long developing Ant-Man, the character was not ready for the Avengers. Joss Whedon later had to build the team without Ant-Man and Wasp as founding members, even though they are founding Avengers in the comics. That also changed Ultron's origin. In the comics, Hank Pym is closely tied to Ultron's creation, but in the MCU, that role went to Tony Stark and Bruce Banner instead. Now, if you know Wright's work, you know his movies have an atmosphere of their own. They are full of little visual tricks, rhythmic editing, and eccentric personality. Marvel, on the other hand, has often been criticized for repeating similar tonal patterns and safe humor across many of its films. So, yes, the released Ant-Man is fun, but with Wright's involvement, it might have been one of Marvel's most visually distinct films. Later, Wright explained that he wanted to make a Marvel movie, but he did not think Marvel really wanted to make an Edgar Wright movie. He also said that the thing that originally attracted him to the project had gone away as the franchise developed its house style. If Wright's version had succeeded, maybe Marvel would have been more open to strong filmmaker signatures during Phase 2 and Phase 3. The MCU obviously did fine without him, but for me, this absolutely remains one of Marvel's biggest creative fumbles. Just look at Guardians of the Galaxy. James Gunn took a team many casual fans barely knew and turned them into chef's kiss material. Wright could have done the same thing for Ant-Man, maybe even more. Spider-Man 4, directed by Sam Raimi. Without a shred of doubt, I can say that Sam Raimi's Spider-Man 4 is probably one of the biggest heartbreaks for an entire generation of fans. And how could it not be? Raimi's Spider-Man films, along with Blade and Fox's X-Men, helped build the early modern age of Marvel movies. When Spider-Man 3 was released, it made around $895 million worldwide, making it the highest-grossing film of Raimi's trilogy. The first Spider-Man made around $821 million, while Spider-Man 2 made around $795 million. So yes, forgive me when I say this, Mr. Raimi, but I have a few bones to pick. Spider-Man 4 was planned for a 2011 release, and it had some notable names attached. Tobey Maguire was expected to return as Peter Parker, while John Malkovich was reportedly in talks to play the Vulture. Anne Hathaway was also attached or strongly linked to Felicia Hardy. However, reports differed on whether this version of Felicia would become Black Cat or a new villainous figure sometimes described as the Vulturess. There were also plans for Bruce Campbell, who had cameoed across the Raimi trilogy, to appear as Quentin Beck, also known as Mysterio, in an opening sequence where Spider-Man fights lower-level villains. Writer James Vanderbilt worked on the project, and Sony even explored future sequels. At one point, there were reports that Sony wanted to move quickly on Spider-Man 4 and potentially develop further installments as well, but the fourth movie never found the shape Raimi wanted. Raimi was unhappy with how Spider-Man 3 turned out and wanted Spider-Man 4 to restore the series, but he struggled to get the story to a level he was comfortable with. After multiple drafts and development problems, he told Sony he did not want to make the movie unless he could do it properly. Eventually, Raimi left and Sony decided to reboot the franchise instead. That gave us The Amazing Spider-Man in 2012. Around that same period, Sony also had other Spider-Man plans in motion, including ideas for spin-offs like Venom. But once Spider-Man 4 collapsed, the Raimi era ended as a trilogy. Just imagine if Sony had made Spider-Man 4 and continued into Spider-Man 5. Raimi could have had something close to a long-form superhero saga years before Marvel made multi-film event storytelling feel normal with Infinity War and Endgame. Today, Raimi does not seem eager to resurrect his version of the Webslinger. While promoting later work, he has said it would not feel right for him to go back and revive his Spider-Man story because he already passed the torch. Tobey Maguire, meanwhile, has sounded far more open to returning. After Spider-Man No Way Home, fans have never fully stopped hoping. For now, though, the main live-action Spider-Man future belongs to Tom Holland, with Spider-Man Brand New Day directed by Destin Daniel Cretton and scheduled for July 31st, 2026. That film brings Holland back and includes major additions like John Bernthal's Punisher, Mark Ruffalo's Hulk, and Sadie Sink in a still-discussed role. But for many fans, Raimi's Spider-Man 4 will always be the one that got away. Daredevil, directed by Joe Carnahan. Long before Marvel and Netflix took over Daredevil, the character belonged to 20th Century Fox on the film side. The 2003 Ben Affleck Daredevil did not impress critics in the way the studio hoped, and it did not become the kind of franchise launcher Fox needed. That being said, I will admit this much. The director's cut is far more watchable than the theatrical version. Still, Fox needed to make another Daredevil film if it wanted to keep the rights. That is where Joe Carnahan came in. Carnahan, the director behind The Grey, Narc, and The A-Team, had his own gritty take on The Man Without Fear. His version would have been a 1970s-style crime thriller, with Hell's Kitchen as a grimy urban battlefield and Matt Murdock as a brutal vigilante trapped in the middle of it. He even made a sizzle reel using footage and mood from movies like Taxi Driver, Serpico, and The Warriors to sell a dirty, street-level version of Hell's Kitchen. This was supposed to be darker, rougher, and more adult than what Fox had done before. Carnahan has described it as a very specific, period-driven vision. In some tellings, the plan could have developed into a trilogy, moving across the 1970s and into the 1980s, with each film reflecting the crime and politics of its era. Sadly, Fox could not move fast enough. The studio's rights window was closing, and Marvel would not grant an extension unless Fox made a trade involving other Marvel characters. That deal did not happen. The Daredevil rights reverted to Marvel, and Carnahan's 70s crime film version was sent packing. Years later, we did get Daredevil on Netflix, and honestly, thank the Lord for that. Charlie Cox's version of Matt Murdock became one of Marvel's strongest live-action characters, but Carnahan's version still sounds delicious. A dirty 70s crime trilogy with Daredevil punching his way through changing decades of New York corruption? Come on, that could have been Marvel's answer to the French Connection with a billy club. Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness, directed by Scott Derrickson. Marvel and creative differences go hand in hand. I mean, the MCU is the biggest movie franchise in history, so they definitely know a thing or two about business. But it is also an unspoken truth in the Marvel industry that Marvel tends to be very protective of its projects, and directors do not always have the final say on the version that reaches theaters. One such case was Scott Derrickson. Derrickson gave us 2016's Doctor Strange, which opened the MCU's gateway to spells, relics, curses, and weird dimensions. The audience ate it up, so naturally everyone expected him to return for the sequel. And for a while, he was returning. Derrickson announced Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness at San Diego Comic-Con and presented it as a scarier, more horror-tinged MCU film. That made sense because Derrickson's background is horror, and Doctor Strange is one Marvel character who can absolutely support that tone. The original direction also involved Nightmare, ruler of the Dream Dimension, or at least that was the long-discussed villain Derrickson had been interested in using. Nightmare is a classic Doctor Strange enemy created by Stan Lee and Steve Ditko, first appearing in Strange Tales number 110. He feeds on dreams and psychic energy, which makes him a perfect fit for a horror-driven Doctor Strange story. Nightmare had even been considered during discussions around the first film before Dormammu became the main cosmic threat, but delays, scheduling, and story changes altered the sequel. Eventually, Michael Waldron came in, the script changed, and Wanda Maximoff became the primary antagonist of the finished movie. The final version, directed by Sam Raimi, still had horror touches, but it was a very different film from what Derrickson seemed to be setting up. In January 2020, Derrickson left as director, citing creative differences. He later said there was no bad blood, but that when a filmmaker and a studio are trying to make different movies, the result can become a monstrosity. So, he stepped away. The movie we got is wild in its own way, and Raimi gave it some signature creepy energy. But the Lost Derrickson version remains fascinating because it may have been a more focused horror fantasy story centered on dreams, fear, and Strange's own darkness. A proper Nightmare movie could have punished the MCU into genuinely scary territory. And honestly, Doctor Strange is one of the few characters where that would not only work, it would feel natural. Fox's X-Men, Fantastic Four, Deadpool, and Daredevil crossover. Before the X-Men and Fantastic Four rights returned to Marvel Studios, 20th Century Fox apparently had some very big plans. And by big, I mean wild. Fox developed or discussed a crossover movie that would have brought together the X-Men, Fantastic Four, Deadpool, and Daredevil. Zack Stentz, who worked on Thor and X-Men First Class, later revealed that Fox had been exploring this idea. Paul Greengrass, the filmmaker behind several Jason Bourne movies, was also reportedly considered or spoken to about directing. The framework sounded a lot like what Marvel later did with Captain America Civil War. The heroes would split into opposing sides after a mission to stop Molecule Man went horribly wrong. During the fight, the Human Torch would go supernova and blow a hole in Manhattan. That disaster would leave the heroes divided over accountability, power, and control. One of the most eye-raising moments involved Wolverine and Mr. Fantastic. Reed Richards would reportedly pin Logan down and cut off his arms. Sure, Wolverine's healing factor means he would eventually recover, but Reed Richards going that far would definitely make fans raise their eyebrows. The movie would apparently end with the heroes coming back together, but the post-credits scene would warn of a bigger threat, a Skrull invasion. Since there are not many meaty details about how Deadpool or Daredevil would have fit into the story, my guess is they would have had smaller roles or supporting appearances. The project never materialized into anything solid. No single official reason has been given, but the timing explains a lot. Before the Avengers hit in 2012, there was not much proof that a massive superhero crossover movie could work at that scale. Then the Avengers proved these movies could make insane money. By that point, Fox had already found new momentum with X-Men First Class, and the studio moved toward X-Men Days of Future Past instead. Also, Fox lost the Daredevil film rights in 2012. Which made this exact lineup impossible anyway. But still, imagine it. Fox could have had its own messy, chaotic, pre-MCU style Civil War. It might not have been clean, it might not have been balanced, but it definitely would have been historic. Gambit. If it had not been canceled, Gambit would have been one of the later films in Fox's X-Men franchise. The character had already made his first major live-action appearance in X-Men Origins Wolverine, played by Taylor Kitsch. But by 2013, Channing Tatum had made it very clear that he wanted to play Gambit. He loved the character and pushed hard to make the solo movie happen. Josh Zedemer was hired to write the script, based on a story by Chris Claremont, the legendary X-Men writer who co-created Gambit. Tatum was set to produce the movie with Reed Carolyn, and for years the project kept moving through different versions. At one stage, the movie was expected to lean more into thieves, mobsters, romance, and the underworld side of Gambit, instead of another global-stakes mutant apocalypse. That was exactly why it sounded interesting. The X-Men were already popular. Wolverine had his own hype, but Gambit could have been the chance to push another mutant into the public eye. Unfortunately, the movie never got there. The project went through multiple directors, delays, rewrites, and release date changes. By early 2019, Disney's acquisition of Fox put Fox's remaining Marvel films on hold. By May 2019, Disney officially removed Gambit from the release schedule, and the rights moved into Marvel Studios' hands. Tatum later described the project as something that got swallowed up by Disney and Marvel when they bought Fox. He and Reed Carolyn have also described their version as a romantic comedy superhero movie with a more adult tone. Tatum has said it would have been the kind of Gambit movie that could exist in the world of Deadpool, which tells you exactly how far it was from standard Disney Marvel territory. After Deadpool and Wolverine released in 2024, Tatum finally got to play Gambit on screen, and fans loved seeing him get that moment. But the lost solo movie still hurts. Maybe one day Marvel will figure out what to do with Remy LeBeau. Tatum still seems hopeful, and honestly, after that Deadpool and Wolverine cameo, the door does not feel completely closed. Sinister Six, directed by Drew Goddard. Drew Goddard's Sinister Six was Sony's big attempt to build an entire Spider-Man universe out of the Amazing Spider-Man films. In December 2013, Sony announced plans for an expanded film universe based on the Marvel characters it controlled. By April 2014, Drew Goddard, known for The Cabin in the Woods, Daredevil, and later high-profile sci-fi writing projects, was attached to write and direct a Sinister Six movie. 6 of Spider-Man's biggest enemies in one film. For a Spider-Man fan, that was grand. The Amazing Spider-Man 2, released in 2014, clearly teased that direction. Harry Osborn and Gustav Fiers discussed assembling a team, and the movie showed glimpses of villain technology linked to characters like Rhino, Dr. Octopus, and Vulture. Goddard later said they were deep in prep, and the movie was officially dated for November 11th, 2016. But then we reached the Sony part of the story, and you know where this is going. The Amazing Spider-Man 2 underperformed compared with Sony's hopes and received a mixed response. Then came the massive Sony hack late in 2014, which exposed internal studio conversations and complicated the company's plans. Around the same time, Sony began moving toward a new agreement with Marvel Studios to reboot Spider-Man inside the MCU. That shift put Sinister Six on ice. There were rumors and reports about different versions of the story, including versions where Spider-Man and the villains would form an uneasy alliance rather than simply having the villains destroy him. Some later reports suggested more outrageous comic book ideas as well, but because the project never happened, we should treat many details as draft-level or rumor-level material. Sony never fully gave up on building a Spider-Man adjacent universe. It kept chasing the dream through Venom, Morbius, Madam Web, and Kraven the Hunter. But those projects struggled to connect as a coherent universe, and Sony has since signaled a fresh reboot of its extended Spider-Man universe. For now, the future is focused on Spider-Man Brand New Day, Spider-Noir, and Spider-Man Beyond the Spider-Verse. But Drew Goddard's Sinister Six remains one of those projects that could have changed everything for Sony. If it had worked, we might have had a villain-led Spider-Man cinematic universe years before the idea became fashionable. JLA/Avengers animated movie from Bruce Timm. This one is not a Marvel-only movie, but it absolutely belongs in the what could have changed everything category. After 2 decades, DC and Marvel have finally become friendlier with crossover comics again. We have seen new crossover energy around titles like Batman and Deadpool, Superman and Spider-Man, and renewed interest in classic Marvel-DC team-ups. But one of the greatest crossovers will always be JLA/Avengers, written by Kurt Busiek, with artwork by the late George Perez. For years, the series was difficult to find, but DC and Marvel eventually brought attention back to it through reprints, tribute editions, and renewed discussion. So when you think about JLA/Avengers, it is almost impossible not to imagine the animated version that never happened. Back in 2009, Bruce Timm, the man behind Batman the Animated Series, Superman the Animated Series, and the broader DC animated universe, openly expressed interest in adapting JLA/Avengers as an animated feature. And honestly, if anyone could have made that crossover work in animation, it was Timm. But of course, with both Marvel and DC involved, there were always going to be hurdles. Rights, approvals, character usage, studio priorities, brand control, all of it would have been a nightmare. The project never moved beyond the wish list or idea stage. Still, imagine it. The Avengers and Justice League in one animated movie, with Bruce Timm's storytelling instincts and the visual language of DC's greatest animated era. It would have been historic, not just for Marvel fans, not just for DC fans, for comic book animation as a whole. Even the original comic had a rough road because the two companies had trouble agreeing on creative and business details for years before the Busiek and Perez version finally happened. So yes, maybe we should let go of the dream of seeing the Justice League and Avengers share the same screen. But now that Marvel and DC seem a little friendlier again, I just want to put in my request. Guys, please give us JLA/X-Men. Every comic geek in the world will thank you. And by world, I mostly mean me. Luke Cage, directed by Quentin Tarantino. Quentin Tarantino, the man behind Reservoir Dogs, Pulp Fiction, Jackie Brown, Inglourious Basterds, and Django Unchained, once toyed with the idea of making a Luke Cage movie, long before Marvel Netflix gave us Mike Colter's version. This was very early in his career, between Reservoir Dogs and Pulp Fiction. Tarantino had considered adapting Luke Cage Hero for Hire for the big screen. He has said that before Marvel movies became the dominant force they are now, he was a serious comic book reader. His favorite titles included Luke Cage Hero for Hire, later Luke Cage Power Man, and Shang-Chi Master of Kung Fu. So yes, his love for Luke Cage was real. Tarantino imagined Lawrence Fishburne as Luke King. In his mind, Fishburne was one of the best actors around and would have brought major presence to the role. But his comic geek friends disagreed. They kept telling him that Wesley Snipes was better suited because he already had the physique. That argument apparently killed the mood for him. Years later, we got Luke Cage through the Marvel Netflix series, with Mark Coulter in the role. Fishburne also found his way into Marvel, playing Bill Foster in Ant-Man and the Wasp. But Tarantino's Luke Cage remains one of the strangest lost Marvel ideas, because it probably would have been unlike anything Marvel later made. A 90s Tarantino take on a blaxploitation-rooted Marvel hero could have been stylish, violent, funny, controversial, and completely outside the superhero formula. It probably would not have resembled the MCU at all, which is exactly why it is so interesting. Doctor Strange, directed by Guillermo del Toro. Before Scott Derrickson made Doctor Strange in 2016, Neil Gaiman and Guillermo del Toro almost made a Doctor Strange movie themselves. This was back in 2007, a year before Iron Man launched the MCU. Del Toro had pitched Marvel on his version of Doctor Strange, with Gaiman as the writer. Their version would have placed Stephen Strange in the late 1920s or early 1930s, as an alcoholic and disbarred position in Greenwich Village. After hitting rock bottom, Strange would turn to the mystic arts, become the Sorcerer Supreme, and live for around 90 years without visibly aging. That premise alone sounds incredible. But Marvel passed on the opportunity because, as Gaiman later explained, Doctor Strange was not high on their priority list at the time. Marvel wanted to concentrate on its core characters and did not want to go there yet. And honestly, I get it. In 2007, Marvel was preparing to launch Iron Man. The company did not yet have the luxury to gamble on its strangest magical characters. Doctor Strange was not a household name outside comic book circles, and Marvel needed safer foundations first. Still, a Gaiman and Del Toro Doctor Strange sounds like a once-in-a-lifetime change. Del Toro understands monsters, hidden worlds, ancient objects, and gothic magic better than almost anyone. Gaiman understands myths, dreams, and strange spirits spiritual architecture like the back of his hand. Their Doctor Strange could have been something truly different. Benedict Cumberbatch's Doctor Strange became an iconic MCU character, but part of me still wants to see the version where Strange spends 90 years in Greenwich Village as the world's most exhausted sorcerer. Now that the MCU is established, it would not hurt Marvel to take a few bolder swings. Fans have seen the formula, and it does not surprise the same way it once did. Maybe one day Marvel will let Doctor Strange get truly weird. Spider-Man, directed by James Cameron. Back in the 90s, Carolco Pictures bought the film rights to Spider-Man from Menahem Golan and began developing a big-budget movie. Carolco then brought in James Cameron, who was coming off hits like The Terminator, Aliens, and Terminator 2 to write, direct, and produce. And with Stan Lee's blessing, Cameron got to work. Near the end of True Lies, Cameron developed a Spider-Man scriptment, which later became one of the most famous unmade superhero documents online. I am attaching the link in case you guys are nerdy enough. Interested enough to give it a read. The story was set in New York and followed teenage Peter Parker after he gets bitten and becomes Spider-Man. Cameron saw Peter less as a traditional superhero and more as a confused teenager dealing with power, puberty, body changes, social anxiety, attraction, and hidden potential. The villains would have included a character called Boyd, also known as Sandman, and Carlton Strand, a character loosely connected to Electro-style powers and corporate villain energy. There were also long-running rumors that Arnold Schwarzenegger was considered or imagined for Dr. Octopus at one stage, though that version did not become the main scriptment villain. The movie would have been far more adult than Raimi's eventual version. Cameron's scriptment included profanity and a very explicit romantic scene between Peter and Mary Jane on the Brooklyn Bridge. So yes, it would not have been your friendly neighborhood PG superhero movie. There were also reports that Cameron had Leonardo DiCaprio in mind for Peter Parker. And honestly, that is some alternate universe news. But everything fell apart before we could see DiCaprio in the spider suit. Cameron's Spider-Man never took off because the rights were trapped in financial and legal chaos. Marvel had sold the rights during a period when the company was struggling, and multiple parties made claims around the character. Carolco eventually went bankrupt. MGM, Sony, Marvel, and others became tied up in rights disputes before the dust finally cleared. By then, Cameron had moved on and made Titanic. He later described losing Spider-Man as the kick he needed to focus on making his own worlds. And, well, that worked out more than fine. Titanic became one of the biggest movies ever, and later Cameron went even further with Avatar. Still, Cameron's Spider-Man remains one of the greatest superhero movies never made. Some elements, especially the idea of organic webbing and a more emotional teenage body horror angle, echo in the 2002 Raimi film. But Raimi's movie was ultimately its own thing, and Cameron went on to build entire cinematic planets instead. So maybe Spider-Man's collapse was painful for comic fans, but it pushed Cameron toward exactly the kind of original world building that made him Cameron. So, those were the 11 never-made Marvel and Marvel-adjacent movies I wanted to talk about with you guys. Some of them were killed by creative differences, some died because of rights drama, some were too weird, too early, too expensive, or too far outside the studio's comfort zone. But all of them show one thing clearly. Superhero movie history could have gone in many different directions. Edgar Wright could have made Ant-Man one of Marvel's most stylish films. Raimi could have continued his Spider-Man saga. Fox could have had its own Civil War. Tarantino could have given us a Luke Cage movie before the MCU even existed. Cameron could have made a horny, teenage, body horror Spider-Man before Raimi ever got the call. And honestly, that is what makes these lost projects so fascinating. They are not just canceled movies, they are alternate timelines. If you enjoyed this breakdown, hit like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments which canceled Marvel movie you would save first. That is it from my side today. I will see you guys in the next one. Have a good day.